Our topic for study in this session is the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. This is the great messianic prophecy of the book, and as we begin, let us pray. Loving Heavenly Father, we want to thank you today for your word inspired to your servant of old, which speaks to us of Jesus Christ and his messianic office and messianic work here in this world, as revealed to us in the Gospels. Give us a greater understanding of that work and its significance for our lives as we study this prophecy today. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. The prophecy of Daniel 9:24 to 27 actually divides in two sections. There is the summary statement of verse 24. Verse 24, which has the overall time period and a summary statement about the things that are to happen within that period of time. And then there is the more detailed explanation of verses 25 through 27. So this is the overall summary. And then we follow with the details. The prophecy is introduced by a very interesting prayer. I don't have time to spend much time on that prayer, but let me just notice with you that this prophecy was given in answer to a prayer which was about a specific subject. It was about God's people who were in exile, and Daniel was, of course, praying for God's sending them back to their homeland. But that particular prayer was based in turn upon another prophecy. In fact, it was based in turn upon another time prophecy. Daniel is praying about Jeremiah's prophecy, the prophecy given to Jeremiah, about the 70 years that God's people would be in exile or captivity. And he has seen now, having lived in Babylon for 68 years himself, he has seen that the time is rapidly approaching when it will be time for God's people to go home. And so he is offering an intercessory prayer on behalf of God's people for forgiveness for their sins and for restoration of themselves to their land, which God originally gave to them. In answer to this prayer, Gabriel, the angel, is sent to Daniel, and he is told that he will be given understanding, and he is even praised as being greatly beloved. Gabriel says, "O Daniel, this is verse 22, I have now come to give you wisdom and understanding. At the beginning of your supplications a word went forth, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision." Then the prophecy begins. It begins with a statement of 70 weeks are decreed or cut off upon your people and your holy city. There's three elements here that we should take note of. First of all, I'd like to have you notice the fact that this, in contrast to the great outline prophecies of Daniel that we studied before in chapter 2 and chapter 7, chapter 8 and 11, this is not one of those great outline prophecies of world history. This is a more sharply, locally delimited. This is a prophecy which deals more specifically with your people and your holy city, the Jews who will return to Judah and Jerusalem. That is the more narrow focus of this prophecy. 70 weeks are cut off or decreed. What does that word weeks mean? Much discussion of this particular word, and the commentaries are divided on its actual significance. Let me pronounce the word for you in Hebrew, and then we'll discuss it. The word here is shavuim. It comes originally from the word seven, which is sheva. Sheva is now given some different vowels and becomes shavua, which is a week. And the word week is used 12.5 times in the Old Testament, this word shavua in singular and plural. It occurs 5 times in this passage. It occurs twice more in the next chapter of Daniel, and the rest of its occurrences are elsewhere in the Old Testament. For example, the feast or festival that we call Pentecost was actually known to the ancient Hebrews as the Feast of Weeks, and the word used there was Shavuot. It's the plural. The ot ending on that same word is the plural. Now, there are two different schools of thought as to what this word means. Some say, as this translation which I have in front of me here, is that it means weeks. Some say, some commentators, even some translations now have, not weeks, but sevens. And so those who follow that latter point of view say, well, it means 77s of years. I would prefer the translation of weeks for several reasons, but let me point out the significance of the difference. If you say it's 77s, and then say, well, the word understood with that numeral is years, you are giving the time element to the prophecy, which stands apart from the other time elements in the book of Daniel. If you say it's weeks, and those weeks consist of days, not years, those days must then stand for years on the basis of another principle, on the year-day principle that we'll talk about in the next lecture. Now, which one of these two views is correct? Well, it seems like to me the place to start is simply with a word study of this word itself in the Hebrew Bible. And if you take into account all of those 12.5 occurrences, excluding the 5 here, in every instance, every translation and every commentator admits that all those other references should be translated weeks. It seems like to me then, on the basis of analogy, with a word study elsewhere in the Bible, the word should be translated as weeks. Not only is it that specific elsewhere in the Old Testament, but it's that, even more so, it's that specific right here in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 10, verses 2 and 3, it says, "In those days I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no meat, no meat entered my mouth. I did not anoint myself at all for 3 full weeks." Then he goes on to say that on the 24th day of the month I was out at the Tigris River and he was praying and so on and so forth. The word that occurs there twice is the same word for week that occurs back here in Daniel 9. It is modified by the following word of days. It says literally 3 weeks of days. Now some interpreters say, well, that means 3 weeks of days here, but 3 weeks of years without the word year being written back in the preceding prophecy. That point of view is based on a misunderstanding of a Hebrew idiom. Whenever the Hebrew text says weeks of days, or months of days, or years of days, what it means is full, whole, or complete weeks. So what Daniel's really saying is for 3 full weeks. He's not saying for 3 weeks of days. It's a Hebrew idiom, and therefore should be translated accordingly. So, the word is the same, and it seems very arbitrary to me that we should translate it differently in Daniel 10, 5 verses later from the one we've been looking at. So to boil all this linguistic study down into a very simple point, the word is weeks. So the linguistic evidence supports the reading of weeks. The should be translated as weeks, and then one must interpret that, which we will do later. Then the question is whether the word is decreed or cut off. And I will come back to that point since it's not too pertinent to us right here in discussing the direct contents of Daniel 9, but it is very pertinent in terms of its relationship with Daniel 8. I will come back to that word later when we get into some appendixes on our present study. For the present, let's just say 70 weeks are cut off upon your people and your holy city. What follows then is a series of 6 infinitives. In the Hebrew, they are infinitive verbs with objects of things to be accomplished within this overall time period. Let me also say that every commentator who's ever written on this passage admits these are symbolic time units. They are not literal. It's not a literal 1.5 years. That's very obvious because as you get into the detailed section of the chapter, you start with the rebuilding of the city, then you have the coming of the Messiah and his work, and then the destruction of the city. And there's obviously no way in the world you can squeeze all of that into 1.5 years, literally, a literal 1.5 years. So we're dealing with symbolic time that is spread out over these 70 symbolic weeks. And within the 70 symbolic weeks, or by their end, 6 different items of work are to be accomplished. I would suggest to you that the first pair has to do with Judah, and Judea. It is the work of God's people, what they are to accomplish. The next pair of items are God's responsibility, and the final pair is the results. So we have a pair of infinitives for each one of these. Let's look first of all at the pair of infinitives that are the responsibility of God's people, the people of Judea, during this prophetic time period. They are to finish the transgression and to put an end to sin. The word transgression here, I should say that the Hebrew language, like the English language, has a number of words for sin and transgression and wickedness and evil and so forth. And each one of these words has a slight different shade of difference in meaning. The word used here, pesha, refers to sin as rebellion against God. So a rather free translation would be to finish the rebellion, to put away rebellion, to stop rebelling against God, stop being rebellious people. So that's the first charge. They are to put an end to sin. The other side of that coin is to bring forth a righteous society which is fit to meet the Messiah and receive him. So these were the charges of the people of God, to cease their rebellion against God, to bring forth a righteous society. These were the responsibilities incumbent upon the people of God within this probationary time period. Now then, there comes God's responsibilities: to atone for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness. In the temple that was to be rebuilt after the exile, and even in the temple before the exile that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, there was an ongoing round of sacrifices. These sacrifices made atonement for sin, but they only made it on a temporal or ongoing basis. It was a continuing act of atonement, that each sin was atoned for by these services. But what is in view here does not seem to be that, or it would be phrased differently, but rather it is one final atonement for iniquity. One great atonement, not just the ongoing everyday atonement carried out in the temple services, but one final act of atonement for sin. That act of atonement for sin, as we know from the New Testament, was accomplished by Jesus Christ on the cross. And so I would understand this phrase as being God's responsibility. God has taken upon himself the ultimate responsibility of atoning for man's sin by sending his Son forth into the world, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem those that were under the law, to make the final atonement, the ultimate atonement. In so doing, by making that atonement, he accomplishes something, and what he accomplishes in terms of this prophecy is to bring in everlasting righteousness. The atonement that Jesus Christ made on the cross brings in everlasting righteousness at that point in time. There is no qualifications any longer as to the temporary measure of man's atonement and his righteousness. But God has taken this responsibility upon himself and has accomplished it in Jesus Christ. The last two phrases of this summary verse are more difficult to study and understand. The first one says, to seal both vision and prophet, and the next phrase says, and to anoint a most holy place or a holy of holies. Let's take the second one first, to anoint a most holy place, or literally in the Hebrew, a holy of holies. Kodesh, Kodeshim are the Hebrew words, holy of holies. What does this mean? If you study the interpretation of this phrase back in the literature of the church, you will find that there have long been two major interpretations of this phrase. One view has seen it as the anointing of the Messiah, and you can find that all the way back into the early church fathers. The other view has been that it refers to the anointing of a sanctuary. Now, which one is correct? If you study the phrase, holy of holies, in the Old Testament, and see what is connected with, it is always a sanctuary word. It may apply to the most holy place, the interior of the sanctuary. It may apply to the holy place, the outer apartment of the sanctuary. It may apply to the sanctuary as a whole, the whole thing, or it may be applied sometimes, attached to, objects that were used in the sanctuary. So it is a sanctuary word. There's only one possible exception in Chronicles, which is connected with Aaron, and my understanding, even in that passage, it refers not to Aaron as the Holy of Holies, but rather to the sanctuary in which Aaron ministered. So my understanding of all the occurrences of this phrase in the Old Testament is it is always connected with a sanctuary. It's a sanctuary word. It is not talking about a person, but it's talking about a place, the sanctuary. Now, the question then, if we accept that, the conclusion from that word study would be, well, what sanctuary is involved here? We have about 3 or 4 sanctuaries to look at. It obviously is not the tabernacle in the wilderness, which went out of use long before, even before Daniel's time. It obviously is not the second temple, or I mean the first temple, Solomon's temple, because that was destroyed in Daniel's own time, and that is not in view here. There is a second temple, sometimes called Herod's temple, but even that is not in view here, I would suggest to you, because if you look down in verse 26, you will read about the people of the prince who are to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So a sanctuary is going to be destroyed, and yet there will be another sanctuary anointed. What sanctuary do we have left then? By process of elimination, there's only one other sanctuary. That's the heavenly sanctuary. So my understanding of this phrase would be, it does refer to a sanctuary. By a process of elimination of all the available biblical sanctuaries, the sanctuary in view must, by process of elimination, be the heavenly sanctuary. So this is the referring to the anointing of a heavenly sanctuary. Now, what anointing of the heavenly sanctuary is that? Well, remember, when Jesus Christ ascended to heaven, he took up his priestly ministry in heaven. Sanctuaries are anointed for ministration. If you look back at Exodus 40 about the tabernacle in the wilderness, it was anointed for the ministration, the Levitical, Aaronic ministration that was to go on in the tabernacle. And so now we have the anointing of the heavenly sanctuary for ministration, the ministration of Jesus Christ as our high priest, as pointed out for us in the book of Hebrews. So that would be my understanding of the significance of this phrase, to anoint a holy of holies, to anoint the heavenly sanctuary for the ministry of Jesus Christ. And that takes place by the time of the end of this time, the probationary time period. Then the other phrase, moving back one, is a little difficult also. To seal up both vision and prophet. The word there is not prophecy. It is not vision and prophecy, but rather it is vision and prophet, the man. There is a distinction in the original language between prophecy and prophet. There's a different spelling to the word, and the word used here is prophet, the person. Now what does that mean? Well, to seal can mean any one of several things. It can mean to seal, to affirm, to validate as true. That's one possibility. It can mean to close up, to roll up, to close away from view for the time being. It can mean to affirm in the sense of validating it as true, or it can mean to stop, to bring to an end, to close off. To seal can be to put away for a time being, or it can mean to simply bring to an end, to seal up. It's closed up, over and done with. Any one of these three possible meanings could be involved here. Which one is it? Well, as I have looked at this phrase and thought about its significance, I have come to some slightly different conclusions from other commentators about it. And the conclusion I've come to about is that that word prophet, as a man, is very important. As we have looked at this prophecy, and as we have spelled out the time periods that we will look at shortly, we have come down to the year AD 34, and we have said, well, in that year, Stephen was stoned, and therefore that marks the end of the prophetic time period, the stoning of Stephen. Well, I have asked myself about that interpretation that has been offered. What is so significant? Why Stephen? I mean, after all, there were other Christian martyrs. We have some in the book of Acts. Paul says he killed some Christians. So there are other Christian martyrs. What is there about the stoning of Stephen that is particularly significant theologically? And so I have looked at that in more detail, and I have noticed two prominent elements. First of all, there's the speech. In Acts chapter 7, it gives you the speech of Stephen before he was stoned. That speech is a very interesting speech in that it is a great recital of history. Stephen starts in by starting with Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the sons who were in Egypt, and then he comes down to Moses and Aaron, and then he goes on down to David and the judges, Joshua, judges, and the David and Solomon and so forth. So he has this long, long speech about history. What is that all about? To the modern reader, that sounds a little boring, really. But to the ancient reader, coming out of the setting and life of the ancient Jews, I think they would have found it much more significant. And I want to point out to you for a moment a potential connection here, and that is with the covenant. Now, in the last quarter century, we have learned a lot about ancient covenants. We've learned a lot about ancient covenants in the Bible, and we've learned a lot about ancient covenants outside of the Bible. And one of the things that we have learned is that those ancient covenants were written according to a certain format, certain formula, certain organization or outline. And the outline goes something like this. First, there's a preamble. Now, the preamble identifies the party making the covenant. Preamble identifies the party making the covenant. Then there's the prologue. And in the prologue, the person making the covenant identifies the past relations between the two parties. If it's an ancient king, the great king making the covenant with the little king will say, well, I put your father on his throne, and I have protected your country from your foreign enemies, and so on and so forth. Past relations. Then there are the stipulations. The obligations that are imposed upon the inferior party, what they are to do. Then there are the blessings and curses. You can read these, for instance, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26 through 33, are the whole long list of blessings and curses added to the whole treaty of the book of Deuteronomy. And then there are the witnesses. Now, in ancient pagan covenants outside of the Bible, the witnesses were the gods of the two parties making the covenant. In the biblical society of the Israelites, of course, they could not use the polytheistic pagan gods, so other things take the place. The stones of witnesses. You yourselves are witnesses this day. This song which I write, Deuteronomy 32, and so forth. The sacrifices. So there are other witnesses for the Israelites. So this is an outline for the covenant. And you can follow this from Exodus 20 to 23. You can follow this all the way through the book of Deuteronomy. Now, when the prophets came along, the prophets were not... there was a great critical professor in Germany by the name of Julius Wellhausen in the late last century, and he held that there was an evolutionary model to the religion of Israel, and that evolutionary model reached its peak with the prophets. Well, he misunderstood the nature of the prophets, because the prophets were not religious innovators. They were not the peak of ethical monotheism. They were rather reformers, just like Martin Luther wanted to reform the church of the 16th century. So the prophets wanted to reform the people of Israel. How did they wish to reform the people? They wanted to reform the people of Israel by bringing them back to this covenant. They wanted to bring them back to the covenant that had been founded by Moses. And so when they did this, they sometimes gave speeches that are described and are recorded in the prophetic books. They gave speeches which followed the outline of the original covenant. And I don't have time to cite a lot of this type of literature to you, but it's fairly common in the Old Testament. A beautiful example of it is Micah chapter 6. Micah chapter 6 is one of these types of speeches that is based on the form of the original covenant. And this type of speech is known as the lawsuit speech. The lawsuit speech of the prophets, in which they take the covenant form and apply it to the people in their time. And let me just give you a quick rundown on what we have here. Verses 1 and 2 is the preamble and prologue. Verses 1 and 2 is the preamble. Verses 3 through 5. Notice the prologue deals with past historical relations. O my people, what have I done to you? And what have I wearied you? I brought you up from the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage. I sent you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and so forth. That's the prologue that the prophets say. The preamble, the first two verses, the call to judgment. The prologue, the stipulations then, verses 6 through 8. What is the stipulation that the prophet calls here? He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. That's the overriding stipulation right here. Then the blessings and the curses which follow. Here are the curses that they will be defeated, their country will be overrun, and so forth, if they do not hearken to this. So, here's one of these prophetic covenant lawsuit speeches, and they follow this format. Now think for a moment, notice the verses that I read to you, verses 3 and 4, that come from this section, the past historical relations, as made with the original covenant setting, and as made as described again by the prophet. Now think for a moment now. I hope that you might see that the historical speech given by Stephen at the time of his stoning takes on a lot more significance. You can see that now as a covenant lawsuit speech in which that lengthy speech which he gives of describing all the past relations of God and his people fits the prologue of the covenant lawsuit speech of the prophets. So if you look at the experience of Stephen through Old Testament eyes, it becomes much more significant than simply a long, boring speech about history. The second aspect of Stephen's experience is this. As they rejected his speech, they dragged him outside the city to stone him. And in so doing, at that time, Stephen, just before he dies, looks up into heaven, and he has a vision, and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father. In that vision, now let me comment on that. My understanding, number one, by virtue of looking into heaven, that is, by definition, a vision. The second definition is that prophets are the ones who have visions. Therefore, at this point in time, when Stephen has this vision into heaven, he is thereby a prophet. He is a prophet by virtue of looking into the heavenly court. He is a prophet by virtue of giving the covenant lawsuit speech. And what happens? His speech is rejected. They rush upon him, they stone him, they kill him. The prophet's voice is silenced. The prophet has been, the man, the prophet, has been sealed up. Now, that is the understanding that I would find in this phrase of Daniel 9:24. That, that is the last vision ever given to a prophet of God who was sent to Israel as the elect people of God. Now, there are other prophets in the New Testament, but there is a distinct difference. The rest of the prophets in the New Testament, like the daughters that prophesy in Acts, or Paul, or John the Revelator, or what have you, they are Christian prophets. They are prophets who prophesy to the Christian church. Stephen stands in the midst of the Sanhedrin, the religious governing body of the Jews, and delivers this covenant lawsuit speech to the Jews, who are still, up to this point, the elect people of God. At this time, however, at this date, the prophetic probationary time period has concluded. The covenant lawsuit speech is rejected. The prophet's vision into the heavenly court is rejected. And the prophet is killed. The prophetic voice falls silent. So that's my understanding of the real significance of this phrase in Daniel 9. It's not just an affirmation of the truth of the prophecies, or that they will one day be opened again to be restudied, but rather the prophet's voice to the people and the holy city addressed in this prophecy has now fallen silent and has been sealed up. All right, we come now in verse 25 to the detailed section of the prophecy. In the detailed section of the prophecy, it starts off by reciting two events and then the time period in between them. Know therefore and understand, from the going forth of the word to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem, that's event number one, the decree for the rebuilding of the city, to an anointed one, a prince, or to the Messiah prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now, in some modern translations, in fact several, that punctuation of this verse is given differently than the way I just read it to you. I have before me the Revised Standard Version, and it reads, to the coming of the anointed one there shall be 7 weeks, period. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again, squares and moat, but in a troubled time. Well, that punctuation follows a Jewish manuscript, or the type of pointing put into the Jewish manuscripts in the late 1st millennium A.D. by some scribes known as the Masoretes. The Masoretic punctuation, they put a semicolon between those two numbers, a strong accent there. Not a period, but a strong accent. If you go back to the Greek Old Testament, the translation made in the 3rd or 2nd century B.C., you will see a different punctuation. You will see the punctuation followed by the King James Version. And in this case, I think that punctuation is correct. I've written a short little note on this subject, analyzing this as poetry. I actually much of prophecy was written in poetry in the Bible, as you probably know. Even other prophecies in Daniel are given in poetry. So it really should say, from the going forth of the decree to the Messiah, 7 weeks and 62 weeks. You see, there actually is a poetic progression here. And the poetic progression goes something like this. It's it's city, Messiah, 7 and 62. And so A goes with A and B goes with B. Straight synonymous parallelism. So the 7 weeks belongs to the rebuilding of the city. The 62 weeks on beyond that goes to the Messiah. So that's the pattern of the passage. So I think the older King James Version happens to be more correct in this particular case. Now, there are several aspects that we need to discuss of a rather technical nature right here about this decree in this time period. And I'm sorry that they are somewhat detailed, but they're somewhat inescapable to deal with. First of all, which decree? The problem is this. If you go to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and look for the decree that refers to the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem, you are immediately confronted with 4 different decrees. And so you have 4 different decrees to look at, and you have to decide which one of the 4 is the correct one with which to start the decree that has to do with this time period of this prophecy. Let me give you those. The first one is the decree of Cyrus, and the year happens to be 538, I guess. 538. That's in Ezra chapter 1. The next decree is a decree of Darius, and that is in 520. And that's in Ezra chapter 6. The next decree is the decree of Artaxerxes. And that's in 457. That's Ezra chapter 7. And then the final one is the second decree. Let's call these 1 and 2 of Artaxerxes. And that's in 444. And that is to Nehemiah the governor. And that's found in Nehemiah chapter 1. Which one of these 4 should we choose to start our prophetic time period from? I want you to notice that basically there is a pattern here. And the pattern here is that these deal with the temple, and these deal with the city. Let me explain that a little bit. The decree of Cyrus is about the return of the Jews, and upon their return they may build the city. Temple. Let's look at that. Ezra chapter 1. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem and in Judah. Then the commission is given to any of the people who want to go back. Let them go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. So there's very specific. It's stated that it is the temple that is to be built. Now what happened is they get back. They start the construction project, described in Ezra 3 and 4. And then the opposition, described at the beginning of Ezra chapter 4, comes up. And the opposition is the Samaritans. The Samaritans come up. They want to participate in the building project. But the Jews say, no, we don't want to have anything to do with you. Go take care of your own affairs. We won't let you cooperate in this building project. So the Samaritans then go away and raise opposition among the governors in the west and even sue at court in Persia, the text sounds like. All right, then the project is stopped. Now the project is stopped for almost, for 15 years, for this period of time. And then a new king comes on the Persian throne, Darius the Great, Darius the First. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah are sent to the people of God to stir them up, to get them to get on with this building project of the temple. They get started. The governors in the west hear that the construction is going on. They come up to the city and ask, what's happening? And they say, we're building this temple, and we're doing it because Cyrus gave us a decree. This is in the time of Darius then. They say, wait a minute, we better find out about this. So they write letters to Darius. Darius makes a search in the archives. They find the original decree of Cyrus, and Darius writes back and says, it's okay, let them go ahead and build. And that is described in Ezra chapter 6, and it is very detailed. The description of the decree that they found in the archives says, let the house be built, the place where sacrifices are offered at Jerusalem. Its height shall be 60 cubits, its breadth 30 cubits, 1 course of great stones, 1 course of timber, let it all the cost be paid out of the royal treasury. So it's very specific about the temple is what is dealt with. Then finally the Jews proceed under the stimulus of the prophets, and they complete the building of the temple at the end of Ezra chapter 6. So this cycle is decree, return, commencement of the project, opposition, cessation of the project, recommencement of the project, and final completion. It's a second decree. Now, here we have the same pattern, only this time it's with the city. A new return, Ezra and those with him, something like 7,000 people go back. They get started on building the city, and I'll give you the evidence for that in a minute. But then they got stopped by opposition from the western governors. Then Nehemiah then is sent with a new decree authorizing him as governor of Judah, and then the project is carried through to completion. So each of these cycles has the same pattern of commencement of project, opposition, cessation, and then commencement again, and it's carried through to completion. Now the crucial question here then, since this is the first decree about the city, is did they actually begin to build the city in accordance with this decree? The problem here is, if you read Ezra chapter 7 and start with verse 11, this is a copy of the letter which King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra, and you read all the way through it down to verse 26, you do not find any specific reference to the building of the city. Did Ezra indeed build the city, or commence the building of the city, as a result of this decree? And the answer is yes. And the answer is not found in Ezra chapter 7, but it's found back in Ezra chapter 4. And so you might say that it's out of order, but it's out of order for a reason, which I will explain in a minute. But let us make the point first that the building of the city did indeed start. And I want you to notice that what we have here in Ezra chapter 4 is a letter from the western governors. Now these western governors wrote to Artaxerxes the king, same Artaxerxes who sent Ezra back, and they say, Ezra chapter 4, verse 11, to Artaxerxes the king, your servants, the men of the province of beyond the river, send greeting. Now be it known to the king, this is Artaxerxes to whom the letter is addressed, that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now be it known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and walls finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, toll, and tax. And so they will go on to warn the king that, look, if you let these people build their city, they're going to be rebellious and they won't pay taxes. You're going to lose money out of the treasury. So the king writes and says, all right, tell them to suspend it for the time being until I say that they can proceed. And the governors then go up with that letter and say, stop. And then it says, and the governors went in haste to the Jews at Jerusalem and by force and power made them cease. Now, why is this passage about this story, which actually follows chronologically after the episode of Ezra 7, why is it back here in chapter 4? Well, I want you to notice something about Ezra chapter 4. If you start off this chapter, you will see it is a chapter of a particular nature. It has a description of the attacks upon the Jews in the times of the Persian kings. Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, deal with the opposition in the time of Cyrus. Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, deals with the opposition in the time of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Then verse 7 through verse 23 deal with opposition in the time of Artaxerxes. So you see, what is collected in this chapter is thematically the same. You can have a book which is arranged in any number of ways. One way is to make it chronological, events are listed in order. Another way is to make it topical, and that's what Ezra has done here. And in his topical collection of chapter 4, he has given us the letter written in his own time about the opposition to he himself. Who are the people who came up from King Artaxerxes? What return of the Jews occurred then? It's a return of Ezra and those with him. They went up to Jerusalem and they started building the city. How do you know this isn't Nehemiah? Well, you know it's not Nehemiah because if you read the book of Nehemiah, you'll see that Nehemiah was successful. He got the walls up. These people didn't get the walls up. And they had to stop. Nehemiah comes along and finishes the project, or at least finishes that phase of the project. And so these people who came up from Artaxerxes and started the project and got stopped must have preceded Nehemiah. Therefore, they must be those who came up with Ezra. So there's a historical proof of the pudding in the book as to which one really deals with the commencement of the building of the city. Now, why didn't Artaxerxes mention the city in his letter? Well, I can't answer that question. Only Ezra could do that, answer that for us as to why he started building, even though this decree recorded in the book didn't say so. I'll just list the possibilities. Number one, he may have understood it as falling within his authorization, even though not specifically stated. Notice the far-reaching nature of his authority in Ezra chapter 7, verses 25 and 26. Number 2, he may have had oral authorization, not recorded. Number 3, there may have been a second decree. That might seem a little strange to you at first, but if you compare the decree of Cyrus in chapter 1 and the decree of Cyrus found in the archives in the time of Darius in chapter 6, they're not the same decree. One is supplementary to the other. So whatever the reason, the historical point is that Ezra, and as a result of this decree, did indeed come back and start building the city. So that qualification fits. We have 2 cycles. The second cycle deals with the first cycle deals with the temple. The second cycle deals with the city. So this is the phase that begins the building of the city. So this decree is really only a fulfillment of this one. All right, that's the first question that we have to deal with in this point in this verse. The second question is, what about the date? What about the date of this decree? Is it accurate? Is that really 457 BC? Well, there are about 4 different lines of evidence that deal with the date. Now, the date is given to us in the text. In the text of Ezra 7, it says here that, verse 7, Ezra chapter 7, verse 7, "There went up also to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king," some of the people of Israel and so on and so forth. So we have the 7th year of Artaxerxes. The first, equals 458, 457, and that's from the spring of one year to the spring of the next year, or fall to fall, as the Jews did it. I'll come back to this point. Let's just deal with this right here now. How do we know when Artaxerxes ruled? Well, there are basically 4 ways. The first way is the classical historians. You see, for some ancient events and kings and persons, the dates were recorded, and the dates were recorded accurately. For some of these people, in the Greek, I'm talking about the Greek and Roman historians now. For some of those ancient events before their time, the Greek and Roman historians did not have accurate dates, but they didn't know they had inaccurate dates. They recorded dates anyway, as the people in the East told them. It so happens that the dates for Artaxerxes were transmitted accurately. They were transmitted accurately by Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon. And so these classical historians gave dates that were used by the early church fathers in terms of the Olympiads. They used the dates in terms of the Olympiads, the Greek dating system, and the regnal years of Artaxerxes for certain events were given. Now, we have now been able to check those up and find out that they are accurate. This is a case in which the classical dates preserved by the Greco-Roman historians were accurate. Sometimes they weren't, sometimes they were. In this case, it so happens they were accurate. The second line of evidence is from Ptolemy. Ptolemy's canon. Ptolemy was an astronomer of Alexandria of the 2nd century AD, and Ptolemy wrote up his canon, which is of eclipses, and these eclipses go back to 747 BC, and they are dated in terms of the regnal years of the different kings in which they occurred. Modern astronomers have checked those out, and they are accurate. Modern historians have checked the regnal years of the kings, and they are accurate. So Ptolemy, we don't know how he got that information. It's remarkable that he was as accurate as he was, but nonetheless, he was accurate. Now, those dates happened to cross the reign of Artaxerxes in the 5th century BC. And so the eclipse dates given in the canon of Ptolemy helped to fix the dates for the regnal years of Artaxerxes. All right, the third line of evidence then is the Elephantine papyri. The Elephantine papyri are a series of papyri that were excavated on the island of Elephantine in the Nile, 200 miles south of Thebes, the southern capital of Egypt, 600 miles south of Memphis, Cairo. On this island, there was a community of Jews. These Jews were soldiers. They served in the service of the Persian king. Now, they wrote letters in the Aramaic language. I happen to have a photographic copy of one of them. Let me just show it to you here, and you'll get a little idea of what this may look like. I don't imagine you can read the letters, but at least you can see that there is a papyrus letter and written in the Aramaic script. And you might even be able to notice closely enough, there is 2 white boxes on the first line. These white boxes enclose the dates. And you'll notice there are 2, not 1. You see, the Jews who wrote these papyri wrote with dates on their letters that were given in terms of both the dates of the Egyptians and also in the dates in terms of the Persians and Babylonians. They are double-dated papyri. They have a Babylonian date, they have an Egyptian date. Now, the reason why that's significant is because both of these calendars are not precisely astronomically accurate like our calendar is, more or less, but they are short. One is a lunar calendar, which is 10 days short. One was a solar calendar, which was a quarter of a day short. And so these are moving calendars. Now, if you put 2 moving calendars side by side, they really offer only one mathematical solution for any double date. And so you can take the double dates of these 2 moving calendars and fix those dates. Now, some of these papyri were written in the reign of Artaxerxes. And so these Elephantine papyri are another way in which you can fix the dates of Artaxerxes. Now, finally, there is the cuneiform tablets. Cuneiform texts, of which a whole catalog for the Persian kings has now been made up by 2 scholars that list every new moon date for every month throughout the Persian period. And so you can check these 2, dated in terms of the regnal years of the king, of the ruling kings. And so you can date them through this corpus of cuneiform texts. So here's the lines of evidence which fix the 7th year of Artaxerxes as, in terms of the Babylonian calendar, 458, 457 BC. This evidence, I think, is quite conclusive for any chronographer, and as far as I know, all modern chronographers agree with this date for this king. So the date is not really in dispute or doubt. The final question, the third question that we're dealing with here then, is about the Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar was from fall to fall. To make this simple, the Babylonian calendar was spring to spring. And so the question is, what type of a date is Ezra using in chapter 7? The evidence for this really comes from the book of Nehemiah. I won't go into it in detail, but let me simply say that it goes like this. The date line in the first chapter of Nehemiah is the 9th month of the 20th year. The date line in the second chapter of Nehemiah is the 1st month of the 20th year. Why are the numbers of the months out of order? The numbers of the months are out of order is because he's starting with a fall-to-fall calendar in which the 7th month is the 1st month of the year. So it goes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's the Jewish fall-to-fall year. They didn't change the names of the months. They didn't change the numbers of the months. They just started with a fall year, new year, just like we have a fiscal year that starts in July and a calendar year that starts in January. The Jews did that too. So the evidence is that Nehemiah, and there's no way to get around this unless you're going to change those numbers. The evidence is that Nehemiah, the contemporary of Ezra, the friend of Ezra who walked in and out of the temple with him and so on and so forth, was using a fall-to-fall calendar. Therefore, it's perfectly reasonable to use a fall-to-fall calendar here for Ezra also. So we have, number 1, the decree. The decree is the first decree of Artaxerxes. Number 2, we have the year. 7th year of Artaxerxes is 458, 457 BC. Number 3, we have the calendar. That's a fall-to-fall calendar as used by Nehemiah, and therefore Ezra. So these are the 3 points that impinge upon fixing the date for the beginning of this time period. I've spent that much time on it because it's very important to get the very starting point. And then as we move on, we can get more of the events and more of the dates that go with it. All right, we've discussed in probably too much detail the first phrase of verse 25. Know therefore and understand it from the going forth of the word to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. That's all of this that we have dealt with. To the coming of an anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, or 69 weeks altogether. What does it mean, coming of the anointed Messiah, anointed prince? Well, remember, like ancient kings and ancient priests, the Messiah did not become the Messiah until he was anointed. The reason for that is this. The verb, mashak, means to anoint. And so you become the anointed one when you are anointed. You become the Mashiach, the anointed one, when you are anointed, Mashiach. So you have to have the anointing of the Messiah, or at the time of his ministry, or in New Testament fulfillment, in terms of his baptism by John the Baptist at the Jordan River, until you have the coming of the Messiah. It's not his birth that's talking about here. It's the coming as Messiah in ministry. Now we have a date for that too. That's given to us in Luke chapter 3, and there it is the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Now, Roman dates were used in two different ways. If that's a Western date, then it's 26 AD. If it's an Eastern date, it's 27 AD. And Luke wrote it up like an Eastern date. It's written from and for an audience in the East, so it's quite logical to take it as an Eastern date, and we have, therefore, a very nice fix of 27 AD. So we have, working with our dates then, we have, starting from 457 BC, then the next date we come to, after 69 times 7 equals 483, we come down to 27 AD. There's no 0 year in between BC and AD, incidentally. All right, that's the coming of the Messiah in ministry. Jesus is anointed in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. And then it says, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The 7 weeks belong to the reconstruction of the city. Now, that would take us from 457 down to 408. 7 weeks would be 49 years, a day for a year. We do not have any biblical evidence or any extra biblical evidence that deals with the date of 408 BC and what events happened in that year. Now, you must be careful with what is known as an argument from silence. Some people say, well, we don't have any texts that bear on this period, therefore everything happened then, and my theory about what happened then is this. Or you have people who say, we don't have any text from this period, therefore nothing happened then. Those are two abuses of the argument from silence. In point of fact, the evidence is simply neutral. We do not have any biblical or extra-biblical evidence which gives us specific historical information about the conclusion of this. We do have, however, some information that the prophecy is quite accurate here, and that is when it says, it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. We know very well from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah already that Jerusalem, the post-exilic Jerusalem, was rebuilt in a troubled time. We have the evidence of the opposition against Ezra that I just discussed in Ezra chapter 4. We have the evidence of the opposition against Nehemiah in his own book. That when he was up on the walls, his enemies came up and wanted him to come down so they could ambush him. But he wouldn't. He persevered in the project. So we can say, historically, we know that the city was certainly built in a troubled time. Now, the next verse then, going on in the details, and after the 62 weeks. Notice the preposition after. It does not say at the end of. It is actually after the 62 weeks, puts it in the 70th week. What's going to happen then? The anointed one shall be cut off. The verb to cut off here is an idiom for saying he will be killed. It is put in the passive so that number one, he's not going to die a normal death. He's going to die at the hands of somebody else. So the Messiah will be cut off or killed. As you know, the New Testament fulfillment of this is clearly demonstrated in the Roman soldiers being the ones ultimately responsible for the execution of Jesus. Then there's an interesting phrase which follows, and it says, and he shall have nothing. I'm reading the RSV translation. Now that is a very difficult phrase to translate, perhaps one of the most difficult in this entire prophecy. And the question is, what does it mean? If it means, as the RSV has translated this, he shall have nothing, it would mean, it would be present a picture of the poverty of the Messiah. He shall have nothing. And when he dies, he'll be poverty-stricken, no place to lay his head, as Jesus said. There is another possibility, and I actually think the other possibility is a little stronger. Literally what this says is this. It is a negative form of the verb to be, followed by a prepositional phrase. There shall not be, and then prepositional phrase, to, and the pronominal suffix is him. Literally, it says this. There shall not be to or for him. Now what does that mean? Well, one is the possibility of possessions, as I've mentioned. The other possibility is people. And the reason why I would favor the idea that people are involved here is this. In the first place, the very next word of the prophecy in the original language is the word people. The people of the prince who shall come will do so and so. In the second place, God is more concerned with people than he is with material possessions. People are more important to him, especially his own elect people here. So I would suggest that the understood object connected with this really is people. There shall not be any one for him. It is not the picture so much of the poverty of the Messiah when he dies, as it is the picture of the abandonment and desolation and rejection of the Messiah when he dies. As it says in John chapter 1, basically filling in for the words, he came unto his own house, and his own people rejected him. So we have here a picture of the death of the Messiah, and we have here the picture of his abandonment and rejection in that death. Then come more results, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Question is, what people is involved here? We have generally said, well, look, we know historically the Romans came up to Jerusalem in AD 67, began the siege, and it finally culminated in the conquest and destruction of AD 70. Therefore, this must be the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70. Therefore, the people of the prince must be the Romans. Well, that's historically accurate, as I have described it to you. But that isn't necessarily precisely what the text is saying. And I want you to compare here the way in which this is said, the way in which the titles are used in this passage. If you go back to verse 25, it says, from the going forth of the decree unto the Messiah Prince. Messiah Prince. Then when you come to the Messiah being cut off, it is only the word Messiah alone. Now when you come to the people of the prince, it's prince alone. So here you have basically a breakup. You have a breakup of a pair of titles in which one title is distributed to the next verse, or the first phrase of the next verse, and one title is distributed to the next phrase of the next verse. So this is verse 25, this is 26a, this is 26b. It seems to me, looking at the text first before we look at history, that if you look at this distribution of these titles, that the prince and the Messiah are the same as the Messiah prince of the preceding verse. So I don't personally accept the idea that it's the Roman prince here. Now, if you still prefer that idea, fine. If it makes more meaningful to you, that's all right. I personally think that if you look at the way in which these titles are used, they all refer to one and the same person. Well, what does that mean if that is the case? Well, who destroyed the city of Jerusalem in AD 70? Yes, the Romans destroyed it. Why did they destroy it? Well, they destroyed it because the Jewish people were rebels against Rome at the time. In other words, if the Jews had not rebelled against Rome, Jerusalem would not have been burned down. We have a nice example or parallel from the Old Testament times. Nebuchadnezzar was besieging Jerusalem. Jeremiah was in prison. Zedekiah the king comes to Jeremiah and he says, this is chapter 36 or 37 of Jeremiah, he says, is there any word from the Lord? And Jeremiah says, yes, there's a word from the Lord. If you surrender and go out and surrender to Nebuchadnezzar and become his loyal vassal and servant, you will save yourself, you'll save your family, and you'll save this city. It will not be burned down. Zedekiah turns around, he goes back to the palace, listens to his advisors at court, and says, who say, fight and defend the city, and he does. He rejects the word of the prophet, he accepts the word of his advisors. They fight, they are defeated, the city is burned down. Zedekiah had his eyes put out and is taken to Babylon in prison. His sons are killed before his eyes, and then he's taken off as a prisoner. Well, who destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 586 BC? Nebuchadnezzar did, Nebuchadnezzar's troops. Why did he destroy it? Because of the rebellion of the Jews. So the people of the 1st century AD did not learn the lesson of the people in the 6th century BC, and they went through the same historical cycle of rebellion, conquest, and destruction. And so the ultimate charge, yes, the Roman troops were the immediate cause, but the ultimate cause, the final cause, was the rebellion of the people of the prince, the people of the Messiah, brought about the destruction of their own city. Now that doesn't mean that the Romans aren't mentioned here. They are mentioned. They are mentioned under the term desolator. And I will, as we continue on through the text will see that. Its end, that is the city and temple, shall come with a flood. This is a picture of the metaphor taken from nature for troops pouring in through the city gate that has been breached. And to the end there shall be war, that is the end of the city. Desolations are decreed. Then in verse 27, we return to the work of the Messiah again. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. All right, we have here the 70th week. We have the 69 weeks takes us to 27 A.D. Then the 70th week, through the whole week, is to 34 A.D. Through the whole week, the Messiah will make a strong covenant. What does that mean? Notice that it is not in the midst of the week that the covenant is made. The cross itself is not just the covenant here. The Messiah is making a strong covenant with his week, the last week of the old covenant, if you please. He's making it strong for many. When and what information do we have biblically on this? Well, again, notice that it begins at the beginning of the week of his ministry. It does not begin with his crucifixion and death. In what sense did Jesus make strong the covenant at this time? Well, he made strong the covenant in the general sense that he came as the Messiah, the messenger of the covenant. But more specifically than that, I want to call to your attention one text that you might keep in mind here. And that text is Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. If you will read the Sermon on the Mount very carefully, you will see the covenant construction of the Sermon on the Mount. It starts off with blessings, not beatitudes, but blessings. What does the Old Covenant have? The blessings and the curses. If you look at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, blessings and curses, the wide way, the narrow way, the good tree and the bad tree, the house built on the sand, the house built on the rock. So there are blessings and curses. Then what's in between? You have heard that it has been said of old, and Jesus cites 5 different commandments out of the Torah. And then he amplifies on these. And then he gives 5 new commandments with imperatives. So there are 10 commandments in the Sermon on the Mount, if you look carefully at it, from in the 2 halves. So I'm just trying to say in another way what various and sundry New Testament commentators have noted, that there is a very distinct parallel between Moses' covenant on Mount Sinai and Jesus' covenant with the Sermon on the Mount. So it seems, and that, remember, was given at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, or back here. So he makes strong the covenant for 1 week, and I would see it in that sense. But the covenant goes on beyond the cross. There is a period of probation that lasts beyond his death. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall cause sacrifice and offering to cease. Now physically, that did not happen for 40 years after this time. That is, till the temple was destroyed in 70. There were still sacrifices and offerings were carried on in the temple precincts until that time. So it did not happen physically. But when Jesus died on the cross in the midst of the 70th week, the rest of the sacrifices and offerings of this 70th week no longer have any theological significance. They are empty. They have been emptied of their meaning because type has met antitype. And that was demonstrated by God when the veil in the temple was rent in twain at the very time that Jesus died on the cross. So sacrifice and offering have been brought to a conclusion as far as significance Godwards. The final phrase of the prophecy is very difficult to translate, but it probably means, in my understanding, that what will happen to the desolator, the Romans, will be, a judgment will come back upon them. And there shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. That is to say, like Babylon of old and like Assyria of old, God could use them as instruments of his judgment of his own people. But that does not mean that they were to escape inadvertently from their own sentence or their own justice being meted out to them. They too had to suffer from divine justice for what they did, for their actions. And so it is with the Romans here that the Roman desolator, the power that comes up and desolates Jerusalem, will not escape without its own judgment and the decreed end being poured out upon it. Now we have finished a verse-by-verse and phrase-by-phrase examination of this prophecy, and I'd like to finish with just 2 or 3 points. First, that we should continue on and finish up with the dates. We have discussed 457 BC. We have discussed 27 AD. Jesus dying in the midst of the week would be 31 AD. It's very difficult to absolutely prove that 31 AD was the year in which Jesus died. I'm speaking of that point of fact from the point of view of a chronographer or a historian. Now, it should be a very simple fact. It should be very easy to reckon, because we have a Friday, which is the 14th of Nisan, and the 14th of Nisan is, of course, the full moon. And so somewhere along in the late 20s or early 30s, you should be able to take the new moon dates and pick that date out very clearly. Unfortunately, it's not that easy, because the lunar year, which the Jews used, was 10 days short of the solar year. So they had to add an extra month every third year or so, approximately. And that means they're working with an irregular calendar, and we don't know how they put in that extra month in the early 1st century AD in Judah. So I would simply say this, from having gone through the chronological materials dealing with this, that we could narrow it down to the probability between 30 and 31 AD. You can come that close. But to decide precisely between those 2 points, we simply need, if you want to look at it from the historical chronological point of view, you simply have to have more data, which is not presently available. Maybe someday it will be. The final point then has to do with the date of 34 AD for the stoning of Stephen. Well, remember, in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 7 has no date on that. There's no regnal year of any Caesar or anything in there. How do we know when Stephen died? Well, there are different ways of tackling chronological problems, and one way you can tackle that one is through Paul. Now, remember, one of the things that happens is that as Stephen is stoned, Paul is standing by holding the coats. And so, as Paul holds the coats and Stephen is stoned, Paul is still in his unconverted state. He obviously has not yet had his Damascus Road experience. So if we knew when Paul was converted, we could at least get a much closer date on this. Now you can, by working from Galatians chapter 1, which gives the story and dates of Paul's visits to Jerusalem, you can come fairly close. And as a matter of fact, as New Testament scholars have worked on those dates in Galatians chapter 1, most of them or the majority of them have come to the conclusion that 34 AD fits the best date for the conversion of Paul. Some to like a little earlier date, some like a little later date, but the majority of the mean and the median fall right around AD 34. So to suggest that 34 AD is the date for the conversion of Paul and the stoning of Stephen shortly before that is a reasonable chronological procedure, although it's still 34 minus X, which is the short period of time in between which Paul was converted after the stoning of Stephen. So the dates fit. The dates fit reasonably well here. And the next point is the point that Seventh-day Adventists have commonly been very interested in. What is the link between this prophecy and the preceding prophecy, and how do we know they are related? Well, there are about there are a number of ways that if you want to, I have written an article on this, and if you really want to see the details, there's an article entitled The Relationship Between Daniel 8 and 9 in the book called Studies in Sanctuary and the Atonement. But to just boil it down very simply, let me simply say, first of all, there is the prophetic terminology. When Gabriel comes to Daniel to explain this to him, he says, now, verse 23, 9:23, at the beginning of your supplications a word went forth, I've come to tell it to you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. He's referring him back to something he has seen. But he refers him back with the word mare. Consider the word that I bring you and understand the mare. Now, that is not the more common word for vision, which is the Hebrew word hazon. Now, if you look back at Daniel chapter 8, the word hazon, for example, is used about 6 times. Verses 1 and 2, it's used, a vision appeared to me, Daniel. I saw in a vision in Elam I saw in the vision, and so on and so forth. Verse 15, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, the question of Daniel 8:13, how long is the vision? That's chazon, and so forth. But when you come down to verse 26, the last verse of Daniel 8, about the prophecy anyway, it says the chazon, the mare of the evenings and mornings, which has been told is true, but seal up the vision, chazon. Now the mare is of the evenings and mornings. The evenings and mornings. Where do you get the evenings and mornings in Daniel 8? Well, you get the evenings and mornings in Daniel 8, 13 and 14. So, when Gabriel refers Daniel to the vision, to the mare of the preceding chapter, he was referring back to 8:26a, which leads back to 8:14. He's not saying, now I'm going to explain that whole vision about the ram and the goat with this new prophecy about your people. He's saying that the 2,300 days, or 2,300 evenings and mornings, are explained to some extent by the new vision, the new prophecy that I bring you now. This word hazon is used for the symbolic vision as a whole. The word mare is used for an appearance. And the reason it's used for an appearance there is verse 14 is not part of the vision, but rather the conversation between the angels over the vision. That's the reason why it's an appearance. All right, so link number one, the word mare in Daniel 9:23 leads back into these two verses of the preceding chapter. Number two is the order of the text. The order of the text, and more specifically the order of time elements in the text. There is a pattern in the book of Daniel. The prophetic time element of Daniel 7:25 comes at the end of that prophecy. The prophetic time element of Daniel 8:14 comes at the end of that vision. The prophetic time elements in Daniel 12 come at the end of the prophecy of Daniel 12. So there's a pattern in Daniel. But Daniel 9 is different. It starts right off with a time period, and then it divides that time period up. So there's a reversal of the order. And what that really does in terms of the order of the text is the time period with which Daniel 8 ends is immediately joined by the time period with which the prophecy of Daniel 9 begins. The order of the text, the literary structure of the text, puts those two together. Now the third point is a matter of we'll talk about the word cutoff, but also we want to talk about the dates for their beginnings. INGS, okay. Daniel 9 obviously begins with a specific point, the year in which a Persian king gave a decree about the city of Jerusalem. We discussed the date there. Daniel 8 also begins, the time period of Daniel 8, 13, and 14 begins in the Persian period. If you look at the text itself, now I'm going to mention this briefly, and when we come to the lecture on the year-day principle, I'll do it in a little bit more detail, but I want you to notice this. In verse 13, it says, "Then I heard another Holy One speaking, and the Holy One that spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the burnt offering," and so on and so forth. Notice the qualifying word vision. It is not how long is the taking away of the burnt offering, or the daily, or whatever it is. It is how long is the vision. I want you to notice that qualifying word vision. Now the qualifying word vision in this case is chazon. What does that word chazon refer to? Well, my understanding is, and I think you can demonstrate that fairly well, the word chazon refers to the whole vision. The ram, the goat, the little horn, the four horns, the little horn, and the little horn's actions. That's the chazon. The word is used 6 times in the chapter, and in all the other cases, it refers to that whole totality of the vision, as in the 3 times it occurs in verses 1 and 2. Now, if the question is, how long is the vision? And the vision goes back to the Persian ram, and then he's given a time period, the 2,300 days. In answer to that question, the 2,300 days should start in the Persian period. That's the significance of the question, how long is the vision? But it doesn't say what year. It doesn't say what particular action. The Persian ram did a lot of things in this chapter. It doesn't say what particular one. It just takes it back to the time of the Persian ram. That's another way of saying Daniel 8 starts in the Persian period in general, Daniel 9 starts in the Persian period with one specific year in that period. So if you have a general date and a specific date, and they both fall in the same period, it's reasonable to expect the two to be connected. More than that, or beyond that, we should talk about the word hatak, or cut. I said I would talk about it. And the matter is a little complicated as you look through the dictionaries and so forth, but unfortunately this is a word which occurs only once in the Hebrew Bible, only here. What does it mean? If you go to late Hebrew, Hebrew written in the 4th and 5th centuries A.D., the dominant meaning is cut. If the rabbis cut an ulcer out of an animal's limb or something, they would use this word hatak. Occasionally, it means to make a decree, but only occasionally, not frequently, but only occasionally. Now, what does it mean here? Well, in Hebrew dictionaries, words are listed according to root meaning and then according to extended meaning, meanings which develop from those root meanings. Now, which is which here? Well, in the first place, I think you can see that, let me say this first before we address that. The root meanings are generally the concrete meanings. The extended meanings are abstract meanings. So if you have a root meaning, there's a concrete meaning, that's given first, and then the extended meanings, which are more abstracted ideas, extended from it. All right, which is which here? We have a verb which means either cut off or decree or determine. Cut off, or cut, is the obvious concrete meaning, tangible meaning, and then the idea of determine or decree is an abstract idea, which is the extended meaning. So number one, we know the root meaning and then we know the extended meaning. Cut is the root meaning. So we can say certainly, this much we can say, that in the 6th century BC, this word certainly meant cut. Whether it had developed the meaning of determine or decree, by that time there's no specific evidence. We can also say that even in late Hebrew, the dominant meaning is still to cut. So it's fair to take the meaning of cut here and use that as a supplementary indication, not the only indication. Cut for Hebrew hatak, the verb of Daniel 9:24. So if you take all of these together, I think you can, and that's the point really, not just any individual one, but if you take them as a cumulative total, I think you can see that there's a very distinct and very direct relationship between these two prophecies, not just between these two prophecies, but specifically between their two time periods, according to the directions and instructions of Gabriel. All right, a final point about this prophecy, and that has to do with its literary structure. Now, literary structure may not be something that appeals to you very much, but it sometimes illuminates the text. And what I would like to point out to you is that in terms of the structure of this prophecy, there are some central elements. Remember I said there's a summary verse 24, and there are pairs of infinitives are given. It's the central pair that is the atonement and the bringing in everlasting righteousness. And as you look at the second, verses 25 to 27, you have the city being rebuilt, and you have the city being destroyed, and in the center you have the work of the Messiah, where he is cut off, he is killed, he is abandoned and rejected. And if you look at here's the atonement that God makes. If you look at this literary structure and compare the two, one of the direct implications of this kind of literary structure is that it is the Messiah who makes that, in his death, in his abandonment and aloneness of his death, it is the Messiah who makes that atonement and brings in that everlasting righteousness. So it places a very beautiful emphasis here on the saving nature of the death of the Messiah. And I think Seventh-day Adventists sometimes have not used this prophecy quite right. It is legitimate to make these connections between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. But far greater than that, the stress and emphasis of this great prophecy is the work of the Messiah and what he has done for his people and what he has done for mankind in the death that he died for them, alone and abandoned and rejected. And yet that death was an atoning death, a death that brought in everlasting righteousness for all.